I have always been fascinated by eerie stories. Not just listening to or reading them, but investigating them. I've always been drawn to those places whispered about in bars or mentioned in newspapers. Abandoned houses, old hospitals, forgotten cemeteries. So when I heard about the House of Shadows, there was no doubt in my mind, I had to go there. This story began, like many others, with a random conversation. I was sitting in a local cafe in a small town in Maine, flipping through a newspaper and relaxing after a long day. At the table next to me, two men were speaking quietly, but I could still catch snippets of their conversation. "I'm telling you, it's better not to go there," one of them whispered, a skinny man in a worn baseball cap. "Nothing good happens there after sunset." I know. But have you heard about that photographer?" replied the other, a burly man with thick red hair. "They say his camera was found at the door. But he himself..." They fell silent, noticing I was looking at them. I couldn't help myself and approached their table. "Excuse me for intruding," I began. "You mentioned a photographer? What happened?" The skinny man glanced at me like I was an idiot, but his friend smiled and said, "He means the House of Shadows. If you're local, you should know the story." I shook my head. "No, I'm new here. Tell me." They exchanged glances. The skinny man clearly didn't want to say anything, but his companion decided to share. "The house is deep in the woods 3 miles from here. Old, abandoned. People say strange things happen there. Like something." He paused and leaned closer. "Something lives there." I laughed. "Ghosts? Demons?" "No." His voice dropped lower. "Worse. People who go there don't come back." That was enough to intrigue me. The next morning, I decided to head into the woods. The sun was shining brightly, and I convinced myself that nothing could be scary in broad daylight. I packed a camera, flashlight, spare batteries, and a notebook. Standard gear for someone seeking adventure. The path to the house wasn't easy. At first, I followed a regular trail, but the farther I went into the forest, the darker and denser it became. Tree branches closed in overhead, and sunlight vanished. I felt the chill seep through my jacket, even though it was only early autumn. After an hour, I saw it. The house looked worse than I had imagined. An old 2-story structure with peeling paint and a partially collapsed roof stood among the trees, as if it had been waiting for me. The windows were broken, the door ajar, and the house seemed to exhale an eerie silence. I stopped and took out my camera to snap the first shot. But just as I pressed the button, something moved in the shadows near the house. Probably an animal, I thought, trying to calm myself. But my heart was already racing. I stepped closer and entered the house. Inside, it was just as creepy as outside. The air was stale, smelling of mold and dampness. The wooden floor creaked underfoot, and every step felt too loud. At first, everything seemed ordinary. Old furniture, scattered belongings, books on the floor. But then I saw something that made me freeze. On the wall was a child's drawing. A dark figure with red eyes was painted in black. Beneath it was a caption. "He will come for you." A strange joke, I thought. But at that moment, I heard a sound. It was a soft, almost imperceptible breath. And it was too close. I turned around, but no one was there. "You're imagining things," I whispered, trying to reassure myself. But as I took a few more steps forward, something crashed from the second floor and hit the ground loudly. That couldn't have been a rat. My heart pounded. I wanted to run, but something compelled me to stay. That sound was a call, and I decided to go upstairs to find out what it was. The stairs creaked under my feet, as if protesting against every step I took. The flashlight's beam trembled, casting long shadows that danced on the walls. The second floor of the house felt even colder and gloomier than the first. I stopped at the top step, taking a deep breath of the stale air, thick with the smell of mold and something else, metallic, almost like blood. The hallway in front of me was dark and narrow, lined with doors leading to several rooms. The door at the end of the corridor was slightly ajar. I knew something was there. It was an illogical, almost primal feeling. But instead of turning around and leaving, I did what any fool in my situation would do. I moved forward. The room was nearly empty. In the center stood an old rocking chair, and next to it, a toppled lamp. Black marks, resembling handprints, stained the walls, but they were too large to belong to any person. I stepped closer to the chair and saw it was covered in a thin layer of dust. But the dust had been disturbed, as if someone had just been sitting there. I heard a noise behind me. Spinning around sharply, I found the hallway empty. My breathing grew heavy, and my heart pounded so loudly it felt like it might burst from my chest. "All right, Jack," I whispered to myself. "You're just imagining things." I decided to photograph the room. The camera clicked once, twice, 3 times. But when I looked at the screen to review the photos, I noticed something strange. In the last photo, taken near the chair, there was a shadow in the dark corner of the room. A tall, thin shadow with blurry outlines. And although I was alone in the room, that shadow was far too realistic to be a trick of the light. A cold sweat broke over my body. I wanted to leave immediately, but then I heard a sound that froze me in place. It was a whisper. "Leave," someone said, the voice quiet and raspy, like an old gramophone. I stood motionless. The flashlight in my hand began to flicker, then went out entirely. Darkness engulfed the room, and I heard something moving behind me. Slow, heavy footsteps. I couldn't move. My legs refused to obey. Then I heard the whisper again, closer this time. "You shouldn't have come." Summoning all my strength, I turned around, aiming the flashlight toward the sound. It flickered weakly, but it was enough for me to see a figure. It stood in the doorway. Tall, thin, with unnaturally long limbs. Its face was obscured by shadow, but its eyes burned with a red glow. My heart stopped. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The figure stepped forward, and the flashlight died completely. I heard the rocking chair start to creak, swaying slowly in the silence. I don't remember how I ran out of the house. My legs seemed to move on their own. I sprinted through the forest, tripping over tree roots, not stopping until I reached the road. Only then did I feel like I could breathe. Sitting by the roadside, I pulled out my camera. All the photos were there, except for the last one. The photograph of the chair with the shadow was gone, replaced by a black screen. It took me an entire night to calm down, but even at home, I couldn't find peace. It felt as though something unseen was constantly watching me, as if the shadow from the house had followed me. I couldn't explain it, but I knew this wasn't just my fear. It was something more. The first night after my return, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, those red eyes appeared before me again. The whisper echoed in my ears, even though I was certain I was alone in the apartment. Only as dawn approached did I manage to drift off, but it brought me no relief. My dreams were filled with dark hallways and something relentlessly closing in on me. When I woke up, one thing was clear: I had to find out what had really happened in that house. I started with the library. In the local newspapers, I searched for any mention of the House of Shadows, but surprisingly, there was little material. It seemed odd. In a place where everyone knew the legend of this house, finding written accounts was nearly impossible. However, after several hours of searching, I came across an old newspaper clipping dated 1974. The disappearance of the Gray family, the mystery of the abandoned house. This article became the first piece of the puzzle. It spoke of a family of 5, a father, mother, and 3 children, who moved into the house in 1973. According to neighbors, they were an ordinary family, but a few months after moving in, they were all found dead in their beds. The cause of death remained unknown. Local rumors spoke of a curse. I found a few more articles that mentioned the House of Shadows. In 1985, 2 teenagers went missing after venturing there on a dare. In 1992, a local hunter claimed to have seen a man with burning eyes near the house. His statement was dismissed at the time as drunken ramblings. But the most chilling story concerned an event in 2006, when a local photographer went to the house for a photo shoot. His camera was found near the entrance, but the photographer himself was never found. All these stories had one thing in common: those who approached the house either never returned or came back forever changed. It became clear to me that I needed help. I returned to the same cafe where I had first heard about the house. Perhaps those two men knew more. Fortunately, one of them, the burly red-haired man who had mentioned the photographer, was there. "You came back, huh?" he said as I sat down at his table. "You look like someone who's seen the house." "I was there," I replied. "And now I need help." The man leaned closer, his voice lowering. "You need to forget about that place. Whatever lives there, it doesn't let anyone who disturbs it stay alive." "What is it?" I asked. "Do you know?" He sighed, then nodded. "My grandfather used to talk about it. A long time ago, there was another house on that site, built in the 1800s. They say its owner, Jonathan Crow, was a renowned occultist. He performed rituals and made sacrifices. In 1865, they found him dead, but his body looked as if all life had been drained from it. No one knows what happened, but since then, the place has been cursed. Anyone who tries to live there either dies or disappears. And this entity? I felt a cold sweat trickle down my back. They say it's what's left of his soul. Or maybe something he summoned. But if you've seen it..." He looked at me with pity. "It won't let you go." I returned home with the overwhelming sense that I had stepped onto extremely dangerous ground. If this entity truly was the remnant of whatever Jonathan Crow had created, then I was now its target. And I could feel it. In my own apartment, I started noticing small things. The lights flickered, shadows seemed longer than they should have been. The whisper that had disturbed me at night grew louder. One night, I woke up suddenly and saw something in the corner of my room. A shadow. It didn't move, but I knew it wasn't a trick of the light. It was watching me. When you see something that defies logic or reason, you change. You begin to feel your thoughts consumed by a fear that cannot be explained. It's always there, lurking in dark corners, in reflections of the mirror, in your own dreams. And the scariest part is that you can't control it. The first week after my return was a nightmare. During the day, everything seemed more or less normal. I worked, went into town, even tried laughing with friends. But as soon as the sun set, everything changed. I began noticing that things were out of place. For example, my notebook, which I always left on the table, suddenly appeared on the floor near the door. A cup I left in the sink ended up in the middle of the room. I blamed fatigue or my own carelessness, but each night the fear grew stronger. One night, I woke up suddenly and felt that something in the room had changed. My flashlight was next to the bed, and I slowly reached for it. When the light flickered on, I saw it. The same shadow stood in the corner of the room. It was motionless, but I could feel its presence on my skin. My body went numb, and I couldn't even move. It lasted only a few seconds. I blinked, and the shadow was gone. But the air was left with a smell, a sharp, rotten stench, like that of a decaying body. Dreams became my new enemy. Every night I saw the same thing. I was walking down a hallway, similar to the one in the House of Shadows. At the end of it were doors. And every time I approached them, they would slowly creak open, revealing the same figure with red eyes. One night, in this dream, I heard a voice. It didn't whisper like before. It spoke clearly and loudly. "You opened a door that should never have been opened. Now you belong to me." I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. On my arm was a deep scratch, one I could not possibly have inflicted on myself in my sleep. I realized I couldn't handle this alone. My life was falling apart before my eyes. At work, I couldn't focus. My friends began avoiding me, thinking I was paranoid. But I knew I had to find answers. So I decided to track down someone who had survived an encounter with the house. This led me to Joanna. I found her through a local forum where people shared eerie stories. She had left a comment that caught my attention. I've been there. And I know it will never leave you. We agreed to meet at the same cafe. Joanna looked tired, with a pale face and dark circles under her eyes. She immediately understood that I had seen what she had. You went to the house, didn't you? She asked before I could say anything. Yes, I replied. And I saw it. That shadow with red eyes. She nodded, swallowing hard, as if the memory itself was unbearable. It's not a shadow, she said quietly. It's something much worse. I first saw it when I was 14. My friends and I went into the house to see if the stories about the curse were true. 3 of us went in, but only I came out. And after that, her voice trembled. It started following me. What is it? What does it want? I felt a chill run down my spine. It feeds on fear. Your fear is its energy. The more afraid you are, the stronger it becomes. And you'll never escape it unless you find a way to close the door you opened. How do I close it? I leaned in closer. I don't know, she admitted. But I do know one thing. You can't do it alone. After my conversation with Joanna, I felt as though I was being pulled into an abyss. But her words held a glimmer of hope. The door could be closed. The next morning, I returned to the library, determined to find more information about Jonathan Crow and his rituals. After hours of searching, I came across a mention of an old journal that belonged to Crow. It was held in the private collection of the local historical society. The journal described the occult rituals conducted in the house and their connection to opening doors between worlds. I realized this journal might be the key to everything. The fear you feel when standing before the unknown is paralyzing. But there's something worse than fear. It's the feeling of hopelessness. You know you're being hunted. You know it won't stop until you find a way to end it. Yet with every passing moment, something in your mind whispers that there might not be a way out at all. The search for Jonathan Crow's journal became my sole focus. I approached the local historical society, but it wasn't easy. They were reluctant to grant me access to their private collection. Only after several days of persuasion and a donation to their fund did they agree to let me examine the manuscripts. The journal was old, bound in cracked leather. The pages inside were yellowed, but the writing remained clear. Each page seemed to radiate an eerie energy. The entries described rituals, symbols, and dealings with something Crow referred to as the shadow between worlds. I began to read. Every world has its doors, and they can be opened. Whoever passes through these doors will remain bound to the other side forever. The following pages contained intricate descriptions of rituals, some requiring blood, others ancient amulets. But what captured my attention most was a section on closing the doors. The text stated that the one who opened the door could close it, but only through direct contact with the entity that had crossed through. However, there was a catch. If the ritual was performed incorrectly, the entity would gain full access to this world. After hours of reading, I returned home late at night. The city was already asleep, and the streets were empty. As I entered my apartment, I immediately felt that something was wrong. The air was heavy, and it seemed as though the rooms were filled with an invisible presence. The flashlight, which I always kept on the table near the door, was now lying on the floor. I could feel that I hadn't been left alone. The shadow had become a part of my life. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw those same burning red eyes in the darkness. Every noise in the apartment made me jump. I knew I couldn't stay here. I had to go back to the house. But this time, with a plan. The next day, I gathered everything I would need: a flashlight, a camera, several old candles, and a knife. Crow's journal was now my primary guide. It stated that the ritual could only be performed at the place where the door was opened. The House of Shadows was that place. I headed there just before sunset. The forest, which had once seemed merely dark and eerie, now felt like a portal to another world. Every branch, every sound seemed alive. I knew it was a trap, but I had no other choice. When I entered the house, I felt the shadows come alive again. The air was heavy, and I could hear whispers. They weren't loud, but they echoed from every corner. Jack. A voice whispered. You came back. This time, I didn't stop. I made my way to the same room on the second floor. The rocking chair I had seen before was now slowly moving, though there wasn't even a hint of a breeze. I set the candles in place and began drawing the symbols described in the journal. As soon as I finished drawing the symbols, the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath became visible in the freezing air. I heard a creak, and when I looked up, I saw it. The shadow emerged from the darkness. Its face was indistinct, but its eyes burned like two glowing embers. It moved toward me slowly, its breath as cold as ice. You don't know what you're doing, it whispered. Its voice echoed from every corner of the room, as though it was everywhere at once. I felt my knees start to buckle, but I forced myself to stand firm. I began reciting the words from the journal, but the shadow laughed. You think this will stop me? You're only opening the door wider. That was when I realized my mistake. The ritual I was performing wasn't closing the door, it was doing something else. I felt the shadow draw closer. Its hand, cold as death, touched my shoulder, and in that moment I saw everything. I saw Jonathan Crow standing in this very room, conducting a ritual. I saw how he opened the door, and how the shadow entered this world. I witnessed his death, slow, horrific, as the entity consumed his soul. I collapsed to my knees, gasping in terror. The shadow spoke again. Now you understand. But it's already too late. There are things that cannot be seen without consequences. As I looked into the shadow's eyes, I understood one simple truth. This being wasn't just a part of another world, it was created to destroy. And now, it had set its sights on me. I managed to run out of the house. I don't remember how it happened. One moment, I was in the room, feeling the icy breath of the entity on my neck, and the next, I was standing in the middle of the forest, gasping for air and trembling as though I had just finished a marathon. The flashlight in my hand had gone out, and the camera slipped from my pocket, lost somewhere in the grass. I just ran. When I finally reached the road, my body nearly gave out. Fragments of what I had seen swirled in my mind, Jonathan Crow's face, the shadow expanding like a living mass, and that voice. The voice that continued to echo even now, in my head. You opened me, and now you are mine. I realized I would never be the same again. The days following the incident became a blur. I barely left my apartment. During the day, I tried to read Jonathan Crow's journal, but every page only brought more questions. At night, I sat clutching a flashlight, unable to sleep. By daylight, things seemed almost normal, but as darkness fell, my world became a trap. Shadows began appearing in mirrors, moving on their own. The whispering I'd heard before grew louder until it became an almost deafening scream. I felt something following me, even in my own home. One evening, as I sat on the couch trying to force myself to eat, the lights in my apartment flickered. I heard the creak of a door in the next room. My heart froze. I slowly walked to the door and peeked inside. There was no one there. But when I turned around, I saw it. The shadow. It stood by the window, almost motionless, but I knew it was watching me. Its red eyes glowed, and panic gripped me. "Leave me alone!" I shouted, grabbing a kitchen knife. The shadow vanished, but its whisper lingered. "You cannot escape." The next day, I decided to reach out to Joanna. She was the only person who could understand what I was going through. We met in her small apartment, cluttered with old books, amulets, and symbols she had drawn on the walls. "It's gotten stronger, hasn't it?" she asked after I recounted the recent events. I nodded, struggling to keep my panic in check. "The shadow isn't just following me anymore. It's in my home. I don't know what to do." Joanna thought for a moment, then retrieved one of her books and opened it to a page about binding. "This is what I was talking about," she said. "If you've seen it, you're already connected to it. But there is a way to break the connection." "How?" I grabbed her hand, desperate. "What do I have to do?" "It's dangerous," she warned. "You have to face it. Again. But this time, you have to be prepared. There's a ritual that can seal it back into the world it came from. But you have to perform it in the house itself. My heart sank. Going back to that house was the last thing I wanted. But I knew I had no other choice. We spent the entire day preparing everything needed for the ritual. Joanna gave me a set of candles, chalk for drawing the symbols, and a liquid she called purified water. She also taught me the incantation for the ritual. You can't stop, no matter what, she warned. She will do everything to scare you, to make you stop. But if you succeed, you can seal her away forever. I listened carefully, trying not to think about what awaited me in the house. There was only one thing left for me to do: summon my courage and go back. The next evening, I stood once more before the doors of the House of Shadows. The wind howled, and the trees around swayed ominously. I had all the necessary materials, but my resolve was fading with every passing moment. I stepped inside the house and was greeted by the same familiar chill. The shadows on the walls moved of their own accord, and the whispering grew almost deafening. But this time, I refused to let fear paralyze me. I made my way to the same room where it all began. I drew the symbols on the floor, lit the candles, and began reciting the words of the ritual. The shadow appeared almost immediately. It grew out of the wall as if it were alive and began moving toward me. You think you can stop me? Its voice was cold and mocking. You've only opened the door wider. I kept reciting the words, though my heart pounded furiously. The shadow extended its long arm toward me, and when it touched my shoulder, I felt a freezing cold seep into my body. My words began to falter. Stop, it whispered. It won't change anything. I tried to collect myself, but at that moment the candles went out. Darkness consumed the room, and I felt something unseen lift me off the ground. When you find yourself on the brink of life and death, your priorities change. You no longer think about the future or the fear of the unknown. The only thing that matters is surviving and finding a way out of the nightmare. But what if there is no way out? After the failed ritual, I returned home, but the feeling of safety was gone. The sense that the shadow was closer than ever was unbearable. It no longer merely appeared in the corners of my room or in reflections in mirrors. It was everywhere. The whispering was no longer a whisper. It was a scream that echoed in my mind, even when I covered my ears. You made a mistake, Jack. Its voice was now clear, as if it were standing beside me. You won't escape now. Sleep became impossible. Food tasted like ash. My mind was unraveling, and I knew that if I didn't find a way to end this, the shadow would consume me entirely. I decided to seek help beyond Joanna. If the shadow was this powerful, maybe I could find someone who knew more. After hours of searching online, I came across a man named James Larson, a paranormal investigator based in New York City. His blog was filled with stories about similar cases: haunted houses, cursed places, supernatural entities. The next day, I left for New York. The trip was long and nerve-wracking. Every shadow in the train car felt like a threat. Every noise reminded me of the thing that was following me. James met me in his office, which looked more like a storage room for old books and strange artifacts. He was a tall, thin man with sharp features. His eyes glowed with intelligence and something else, something that suggested he had seen far more than an ordinary person. Tell me everything, he said, pointing to a chair. I recounted my entire story, starting from the day I first heard about the House of Shadows in the cafe. He listened intently, occasionally jotting notes in a small notebook. The shadow you're describing isn't just a ghost, he said finally. It's an ancient entity, summoned by Jonathan Crow. It's tied to that place, but now it has found you. And you're its conduit into our world. What does that mean? I asked, a cold chill running down my spine. It's using you to strengthen its connection to our reality. The longer it's near you, the stronger it becomes. If it isn't stopped, it will fully breach into this world and become uncontrollable. I had emailed James before traveling, detailing everything that had happened. His response had come faster than I expected. Jack, this isn't just a curse. What you're describing is a powerful supernatural entity that's bound to you through your contact with the house. I can help, But we need to meet. Come to New York immediately. Now, sitting in his office, his words confirmed my worst fears. I wasn't just haunted. I was a bridge, and I had no choice but to sever the connection before it was too late. James proposed a new plan. He had access to rare books and artifacts that could help conduct the ritual properly. But you'll have to go back to the house, he said. I froze. Go back there after everything I had seen? It seemed impossible. But I knew I wouldn't get another chance. What do I need to do? I asked. James explained that the ritual required a new element, an amulet he would provide and a precise sequence of steps we would design together. There could be no mistakes. But there's one more thing, he added. You'll have to make contact with the shadow. It will try to disorient you, using your fear against you. But you must resist it. We spent the entire next day preparing for the ritual. James taught me every step, explained how the amulet worked, and what to do in case of a mishap. The pressure was mounting. If I made even one error, it could be the end of me. That evening, just as I was about to go to bed, the shadow appeared again. This time, it didn't hide. You think you can defeat me? It said, standing by my bed. You're just one of many. Its words made me waver. But then I thought of Joanna, James, and the others who had perished because of this house. I resolved that this time, I wouldn't run. All roads had led me back to this house. The weight of inevitability burdened every step I took. This time, I wasn't just returning, I was walking into a battle I might not survive. But if I didn't do this now, the shadow would find a new victim. Or worse, it would consume our entire world. James and I set out early in the morning. The forest surrounding the house felt even more sinister than before. The branches swayed in the wind as if they were alive. The ground beneath my feet was soft and damp, each step eliciting a quiet crunch. Remember, James said as we approached the house, you must keep her in the circle. The amulet will protect you, but only if you stay focused. I nodded, trying to suppress the fear tearing me apart from the inside. James stopped at the entrance. I can't go in, he said. This is your fight, Jack. But I'll be here if anything goes wrong. I pulled out the amulet and stepped inside. The house greeted me with a silence heavier than any noise. Everything seemed the same as before, but now I could feel that the place had come alive. The air was thick and oppressive. Every step I took echoed like thunder in the quiet. I pulled out the candles and began drawing the symbols on the floor. Every movement felt endless, my hand trembling as I sketched the final mark. The amulet lay at the center of the circle, its surface glowing faintly with a bluish light. The moment I finished, the room was filled with an icy chill. Whispers flooded the space, growing louder, surrounding me from all sides. I knew she was here. The shadow emerged from the wall, its long limbs moving slowly but purposefully. It was larger than before, and its red eyes burned brighter than ever. You've come back, it said. Its voice was mocking, but this time I could sense anger beneath it. You want to seal me away? You think you can win? I raised my hand and began reciting the words of the ritual. My voice trembled, but I pushed through. The shadow took a step toward me, but as soon as it neared the circle, the amulet's light flared brighter, forcing it to retreat. This won't stop me, it said, its voice dripping with malice. You're only delaying the inevitable. I closed my eyes and focused on the ritual's words. I could feel a force building around me, gathering strength. The room began to shake, and it felt as though the house itself was rebelling against what I was doing. The shadow changed its approach. Its voice became soft, almost persuasive. Jack, you don't have to do this, it said. I can give you power beyond your wildest dreams. You don't have to be afraid. We can be one. I opened my eyes and saw it reaching out to me. Its face had transformed. It was human now. It was my face. This is an illusion, I shouted, forcing myself to focus. I continued the ritual. The amulet flared brighter, and the shadow howled in pain. Its form began to break apart, dissolving into the air. As I spoke the final words, the house shook violently. The shadow let out a scream that seemed to stretch on forever. Its form was disintegrating, and I could feel the power of the circle pushing it back into the realm it came from. With the last word of the ritual, everything went silent. The whispers stopped, the cold dissipated, and the house became just an abandoned shell. I stood in the center of the circle, gasping for air, but with the overwhelming sense that the battle was finally over. I walked out of the house, and James was waiting for me at the entrance. "Did you do it?" he asked. I nodded. My body was drained, but I could feel that the shadow no longer followed me. "That was the hardest thing I've ever done," I said. "But it's over now." James smiled, but there was a shadow of doubt in his eyes. "You did everything right," he said. "But sometimes, evil can't be destroyed completely. It's always looking for a way to return." I thought I had won. The house had gone quiet, and the shadow had disappeared. But that calm was deceptive. Deep in my heart, I felt it wasn't over. Evil doesn't leave so easily. It always leaves a trace. Days passed after the ritual. At first, everything seemed normal. For the first time in weeks, I was able to sleep. The whispers in my head had vanished, and the shadows no longer appeared in the corners of my room. James assured me the ritual had worked and that the shadow was now sealed. But something continued to bother me. It felt as though the house hadn't fully released me. I began to feel a strange compulsion to return, like a voice quietly whispering in my mind. I ignored it, convincing myself it was just leftover fear. One day, I decided to review the photos stored on my camera. It was a symbolic gesture, a way to close this chapter of my life. But as I scrolled through them, my heart froze. In the last photo, taken just before the ritual, the shadow stood in the center of the frame. Its form was unmistakable, and its red eyes glowed, piercing even through the screen. It was looking directly at me. I immediately called James, but he didn't answer. Desperate, I turned to Joanna, hoping she could explain what was happening. She answered on the second ring, her voice anxious. "Jack, I've seen it too," she said. "The shadow has returned. And it's stronger now." "But how?" "We performed the ritual," I shouted, panic rising in my chest. "The ritual might have been a temporary solution. It will always find another way to break through. But I've learned of one final method." Her voice trailed off. "What is it?" I pressed. "You have to close the door for good. But it requires a sacrifice." Joanna explained that Jonathan Crow had deliberately opened the door to gain immortality, but the cost had been his soul. She added that the only way to permanently seal the door was to destroy the connection keeping the shadow tethered to our world. "What is that connection?" I asked, though I already feared the answer. "It's you, Jack," she said. "The shadow is bound to you. Unless you sever that connection, it will always return." My hands trembled. I couldn't believe it. All this time, I had thought I was saving myself, but I had only been feeding it with my fear. I knew I had to go back. It was the only place where I could finish what I started. I didn't tell James or Joanna. This was my battle. As I approached the house, it looked even more decrepit than before. The shadows inside were thicker, as though the building itself had been waiting for me. I stepped inside and was immediately engulfed by the familiar chill. The whispers returned, but they were different this time, joyful, triumphant. "You've come back," the shadow whispered. "I knew you would." I climbed to the same room on the second floor. The shadow was waiting for me. It was enormous now, its form filling the space. Its red eyes burned with an intensity that felt crushing. "This is your end," it said. "You cannot win." I raised the amulet and began reciting the words of the ritual. But this time, I altered the final line. I knew what was required to complete the ritual. I stood in the center of the circle and focused all my resolve. "I sever this connection," I said. "You will have no power through me anymore." The shadow screamed in agony. It lunged at me, but as soon as its form crossed the circle's boundary, the amulet exploded in a burst of blinding light. Everything around me shook violently. The house began to collapse, and I felt something being torn from within me. I knew I wouldn't make it out alive. But I also knew the shadow wouldn't return. I felt its energy fading, and with it my own. Before everything went dark, I saw the house crumble. Its walls disintegrated, and the shadows that had filled it dissolved into the air. They say every battle has a winner and a loser. But what if victory is nothing more than an illusion? My story ended there, in the ruins of the house, but was it truly the end? Can evil ever be completely destroyed? When the house collapsed, silence fell over the forest. The shadows disappeared, and the ever-present chill lifted. It seemed that evil no longer had a hold on this place. But amidst the ruins, buried in the debris and ash, lay Jack. His body was motionless, but his face showed no pain. On the contrary, it was calm, almost peaceful. The shadows that had once surrounded him had dissipated like smoke. A few days later, James returned to the site of the house. He had known something had happened when locals spoke of a loud explosion and strange light emanating from the woods that night. When he saw the ruins, his heart sank. He found Jack's body among the debris. Beside him lay the amulet, broken but still warm to the touch. James understood that the ritual had worked. The shadow was gone, and the door was sealed forever. But the cost had been Jack's life. James arranged for Jack's burial nearby. He also collected all the remaining records, including Jonathan Crow's journal. He vowed that he would never let this evil return. Weeks after the destruction of the house, James received a letter from Joanna. In it she wrote, "James, I heard what happened. I knew Jack would see it through to the end. He was stronger than any of us. The shadow won't return, but we must remain vigilant. Sometimes, evil finds other doors. If it does, we must be there to stop it. I hope one day we'll find a way to prevent it for good." This story could have ended here, but James kept one secret. While going through Jack's belongings, he found something odd, one final photo on Jack's camera. The image showed the house before it collapsed. But in one of the windows, a shadowy figure was visible. It didn't resemble the shadow they had faced before. It was something else. James kept the photo to himself, showing it to no one. He told himself it was probably a coincidence. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't over. The House of Shadows is gone. Jack gave his life to protect this world. But evil isn't something that can be eradicated completely. It's always searching for a way back. My story has ended. But if you ever hear of a place like this, remember, where there is shadow, there is always something more. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't what you see, it's what you will never be able to understand.